No one imagined that the most beautiful love story that region had ever known was buried right there, under 6 years of silence, of closed doors, and of names that could no longer be spoken aloud. For 6 years, two families divided the same village like those who share a wound. And the people learned to choose which side of the red earth road to walk on. What almost no one knew was that behind all that enmity lay an old love sown in secret, waiting only for someone to have the courage to pull the first thread. Have you ever stopped to think how much hatred can fit inside a misunderstanding that no one had the courage to undo? Have you ever imagined discovering that the person you swore to hate for the rest of your life was once the very reason you believed in love? That is what I am going to tell you about today. And I ask you to stay until the end, because what looks like anger is almost always longing dressed in pride. But this story actually happened in the hinterlands of the Yoruba Hills in May 1897, in a village called Odo-Eye, where the savannah opened into golden grasslands and the river cut through the earth like a promise. Before I continue, do one thing for me. Write here in the comments where you are watching this video, from which city, which state, which corner of Nigeria. I like to know who is on the other side listening to these stories with me. And if you like tales of triumph, true love, and hearts-warming endings, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this from the old days told slowly are becoming rarer and rarer. Now, come with me, for the journey is about to begin. The dirt road that led to Odo-Eye rose and fell like the spine of a tired beast. And it was along this road that Morenike Alao returned one afternoon when the sun was already bending over the horizon, painting the dust kicked up by the ox-drawn cart wheels in shades of copper. She was 28 years old, with the face of someone who had learned early that life does not ask permission to hurt. She wore black, no longer for her recent mourning, but because black had become the only attire that felt honest to her. 6 years ago, she had left that very village, swearing never to return. And now she was returning with a worn leather bag, a chest of iron tools that had belonged to her father, and a tightness in her chest that no prayer had managed to loosen. The air smelled of the wet earth from the season's first rain, the smoke of firewood hearths and burning bushgrass, and each of those scents woke a memory in her that she would have preferred to leave behind. Morenike's heart beat out of rhythm as the first mud brick houses began to appear, whitewashed with lime, their thatch and clay roofs darkened by time. She recognized Baba Akin's provisions shop, the stone chapel with its hanging brass bell, the communal water spring where the women still gathered in the late afternoon. Everything seemed the same, yet at the same time, everything seemed smaller, as if her world had grown while the village had remained the size of a grudge. The cart driver who had brought her from the newly built railway terminal, a quiet man in a battered straw hat, reined in the beasts before a half-broken wooden gate. It was the old homestead of the Alao family, with the watermill at the back, abandoned since her father had died of grief 2 years after she had departed. Morenike got down from the cart, her legs stiff from the journey, paid the man with carefully counted silver pennies, and stood there staring at it all. The roof of the house had a gaping hole. Weeds had overtaken the yard, and the mill, the pride of the family. A contraption her grandfather had built with his own hands, had its water wheel jammed, covered in green slime, silent as a stopped clock. It was in this silence that she heard, for the first time in 6 years, the voice of the village speaking about her. They were not words yet, they were woven raffia curtains twitching, eyes peering from behind shuttered windows, the murmur that ripples through a close-knit community when the past decides to return. Morenike straightened her back. She had not come back to beg anyone's forgiveness, nor to receive pity. She had returned to rebuild her father's mill, to grind the maize and cassava of the region, just as her family had done for 3 generations, and to prove that a woman on her own could do more than those people ever imagined. It was either this or destitution, and Morenike had already known destitution too closely to want to embrace it again. On her first night, she slept on the clay floor of the main room, on a straw mat she had woven herself, listening to the creaking of the old house like old bones cracking. In the darkness, against her will, her memory dragged her back to where she least wanted to go to another night, 6 years ago, when she still believed happiness was a simple thing within reach. In those days, Morenike laughed easily, kept her hair loosely braided, and had a way of looking of the world that made the elders say, this girl would go far. And there was Ayodele. There was always Ayodele at the heart of every good memory she kept of that place. But she shut her eyes tightly, like someone closing a wooden shutter against the wind, and forced herself not to go down that path. Ayodele Olanrewaju was now just a name her family had learned to spit upon, He was the man with the lands on the other side of the river, the owner of the vast herds, the heir of the old Olanrewaju patriarch, the enemy. Between her house and the water that made the mill wheel turn lay the lands of the Olanrewajus, and that was the first of many stones that destiny had placed in her path. But she would only truly understand this the following morning. The day broke clear, with a sky of washed blue, and the savanna birds singing as if nothing bad had ever happened on this land. Morenike woke early, as she always did, and the first thing she did was go to the mill. She ran her hand over the damp timber, examined the locked wheel, and measured with her eyes the scale of the repairs ahead. She understood wooden gears, shafts, and grinding stones because her father had raised her right there in the midst of it, never caring that she was a woman. She knew she could fix the machine. The problem was not the wood, nor the iron. The problem was the water. The channel that brought the water from the river to the mill wheel passed right through the lands of the Olanrewajus. It had always passed there. In the days of her grandfather and Ayodele's grandfather, this was never an issue, because the two families were close, almost like siblings, and the water flowed freely from one property to the other, as it does between neighbors who trust one another. But that was before the night that broke everything in half. Now, to make the mill turn, Morenike would have to ask Ayodele Olanrewaju to open the sluice gate of the channel. She would need, after 6 years, to look into the eyes of the man she had sworn never to look at again. Morenike spent 3 days putting off that conversation. In those 3 days, she cleaned the house, patched the hole in the roof with whatever she could find, cleared the weeds from the yard, and began to scrape the rust from the mill's iron gears, working from sunrise to sunset with calloused hands and a sweaty brow. The villagers watched her from a distance, and gradually, tongues began to wag. At the communal water spring, the women gossiped that the daughter of old Alao had returned harder, colder, a widow before 30. At Baba Akin's shop, the men placed bets on how long she would last alone in that crumbling house before giving up and running away again. It was at the shop, in fact, that Morenike had her first significant encounter. She had gone to buy hand-forged nails, kerosene, and cassava flour, and was counting her silver coins on the counter when the door creaked open and a middle-aged man walked in, dressed far too elegantly for a village of that size. He wore an expensive hand-woven agbada, a gold watch chain glinting on his chest, and clean leather boots, despite the dust of the road. It was Gbadebo Okanlawon, the merchant who had arrived in Odo Eye about 7 or 8 years ago, and had since been buying up tract after tract of land, slowly squeezing the smallholders until they sold what they had for next to nothing. He had a broad smile and a smooth voice that sounded like wild honey, but left a strange, bitter taste in the mouth. Gbadebo greeted Morenike with an exaggerated bow of respect. He said he was deeply sorry for the loss of her husband, that the whole village shared her grief, and that he was at her service for whatever she might need. Morenike thanked him with just the right amount of courtesy, neither too much nor too little, because something about the man kept her on guard, though she could not explain why. It was then that Gbadebo, feigning casual interest, remarked that he heard she intended to reopen the old mill, and that it was a pity such a massive effort for something bound to fail. He said, with that voice of silk, that the water ran through the Olanrewaju lands, and everyone knew the depth of the hatred between the two families. He said she would never get the water, and if she wished, he could buy the house and the mill from her for a fair price, freeing her from that heavy burden. Morenike felt the ground steady beneath her feet, the way it always did when someone tried to push her. She looked Gbadebo Okanlawon in the eye and replied, with a calm that was more unnerving than any shout, that she appreciated the offer, but her father's mill was not for sale, not for a fair price, not for any price. The merchant's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, almost imperceptibly, before sliding back into place. He said he respected her decision, that the offer remained open should she change her mind, and took his leave with the same false courtesy with which he had entered. But Morenike, who had learned to read men during the 6 harsh years she spent away, carved his face into her memory. There was something about him that smelled of rot, and she did not yet know how deep it went. That same afternoon, she decided she could no longer run. She put on her best buba and iro, simple as they were, braided her hair neatly, and crossed the wooden footbridge that separated the Alao lands from the Olanrewaju lands. Every step on those planks was a step back into her own past. She knew this path by heart. She had run along it as a young girl, loved along it as a young woman, and wept along it on the night everything collapsed. The river flowed underneath, calm and brown, indifferent to everything men had built and destroyed on its banks. The Olanrewaju family homestead remained imposing, a grand mud-brick mansion with deep blue shutters and a wide, shaded veranda where, in good times, the families used to gather to drink palm wine and talk until night fell. Now, the veranda was empty. A farmhand weeding near the fence saw her approach and stopped his work, his hoe suspended in mid-air as if he had seen a ghost. It was Babatunde, the farm manager, a trusted hand of the Olanrewajus for over 20 years, with a graying beard and kind eyes that widened as he recognized who was walking toward him. He dropped his hoe and came over quickly, saying in a low, rushed whisper that she should not be there, that this would cause trouble, and that she had better turn back before the master saw her. Morenike replied firmly that she needed to speak with Ayodele, that she was there on business, and that she would not leave without being heard. Babatunde stared at her for a long moment, and in his eyes lay an old sorrow, as if he knew things no one else dared to remember. He sighed, shook his head, and said he would call his master, but warned her to be careful, because the wound was still raw. He went inside, leaving her alone in the dusty compound under the afternoon sun, her heart pounding like a festival drum that no one wanted to dance to. When Ayodele Olanrewaju appeared at the doorway, time seemed to fold back on itself. He was 32 now, broader in the shoulders than she remembered, his skin darkened by the sun, and with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 6 years ago. He wore his farm clothes, a simple cotton tunic, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who did his own hard labor. Seeing her standing in the compound, he froze for a second, a single second that felt like a lifetime, his face softening into an expression that was not hate, but astonishment, pain, and something dangerously close to longing. Then, like a heavy curtain falling on a stage, his face hardened again, leaving only coldness. Ayodele asked, in a tightly controlled voice, what she wanted there. Morenike swallowed hard, raised her chin, and said she had returned to reopen her father's mill, and for that, she needed him to open the channel's sluice gate to let the water flow to the wheel, just as in the old days. She said she would pay for the water if he wished, that she was not there asking for a favor, but proposing an honest business transaction between neighbors. The words came out steady and rehearsed, but inside she was trembling, praying her dark wrapper hid how much. Ayodele listened in silence, his arms crossed, and when she finished, he let out a short, humorless laugh, saying it took incredible nerve for her to come here, to step onto this ground after everything her family had done to his. Morenike felt her blood rise and snapped back, before she could stop herself, that her family had done nothing, that it was his family who had ruined everything, and she knew very well where the truth lay. The two stood there, face to face, separated by only a few paces, and 6 years of different versions of the same tragedy. Each convinced that the other was to blame, each carrying half the story, never knowing the other half was missing. It was Babatunde, standing at a respectful distance, who broke the impasse, saying softly that perhaps it was better to speak calmly, that all of this had already brought too much pain to too many people. Ayodele silenced him with a look, but something in the old manager's words seemed to reach him. He uncrossed his arms, took a deep breath, and told Morenike he would think about the water. Only that he would think about it, and she could go. Morenike understood that this, coming from him, it was already more than she had hoped for, and pushing any further now would only shut the door for good. So she thanked him with a curt nod, turned, and crossed the bridge again, feeling his gaze burning into her back the entire way. Neither of them slept well that night. In the Aloud house, Morenike relived every word, every gesture, and the way his face had softened in that very first second before hardening. In the Olanrewaju compound, Ayodele sat late on the veranda, staring into the dark savannah, a gourd of palm wine beside him that he barely touched, asking himself why on earth, after 6 years of swearing to forget her, merely seeing her standing in the yard had brought everything rushing back at once, like a river bursting its banks. He had learned to live with hatred, because hatred was easier to carry than the truth. But as for the truth, he was beginning to suspect it might be entirely different from what he had been told. 3 days later, when Morenike was beginning to think his answer would be silence, she heard a sound early in the morning that she had not heard in years. It was the sound of rushing water in the channel. She ran out of the house barefoot and saw the sluice gate on the Olanrewaju side wide open, the water flowing clean and strong down the stone bed toward the mill wheel, which began to turn slowly, creaking as it awoke from its long sleep. Her eyes filled with tears without her permission, and she stood there watching the wheel turn with a mixture of joy and something she chose not to name. Ayodele had opened the sluice gate without a word, without sending a message, without demanding a price. He had simply opened it. At the top of the ridge on the opposite bank, he stood watching. Morenike saw him a silhouette on horseback, framed against the morning sky, motionless, watching the mill wheel turn like someone witnessing something he thought he would never see again. For a moment, their eyes locked across the water that both separated and connected them. She raised her hand in a timid gesture of thanks. He did not return the wave. He simply touched the brim of his straw hat with 2 fingers, turned his horse, and vanished into the tall elephant grass. But that small gesture kept Morenike's heart warm all day, and she felt irritated with herself for it, because she had sworn never to feel anything coming from that side of the river again. In the weeks that followed, the mill hummed with life. Word spread through the region, and local farmers, who for years had been forced to carry their crops to a distant township 3 days' journey away, began to arrive with their sacks of maize and cassava loaded on the backs of donkeys. Morenike worked from sunrise to sunset, covered in white flour from hair to toe, and for the first time in a long while, she felt she was rebuilding not just a machine, but her very life. The money, British colonial shillings, began to trickle in, slowly but surely, and with it came something she had almost forgotten: hope. What she had not expected was that the water would force her to interact with Ayodele. The channel required maintenance, and the sluice gate sat on his side. Whenever the stone bed became choked with leaves and silt, someone from both sides had to clear it. The first time it happened, Morenike crossed the bridge, determined to do the work herself, only to find Ayodele already there. His trousers were rolled up to his knees, and he was standing in the cold water, hauling out debris with his bare hands. The two worked side by side for hours in silence, barely looking at each other, hearing only the rush of the water and the call of the birds. When they finished, soaked and exhausted, Ayodele remarked, without looking at her, that she ground well, that the flour coming from her mill was fine and even, and the farmers were praising it. It was the first near-gentle thing he had said to her in 6 years. Morenike replied that she had learned from her father, and her father's name, spoken there in the middle of the water, hung between them like a shadow, because her father had died hating the Olandrawajus, and they both knew it. It was during one of these channel cleanings that Morenike discovered the clearing. Walking upstream to find a blockage, she reached a hidden bend in the river, shrouded by thick trees, where someone had carefully and patiently dammed a section of the water to form a calm, deep pool so clear that she could see the tiny fish darting at the bottom. Around the pool, wild yellow cassias had been planted, and there was a rustic wooden bench, clear signs that this place was tended by someone. Morenike recognized it instantly. It was here, in this exact spot, that she and Ayodele used to meet in secret when they were young, sitting on the bank and dreaming of the future they thought they would share. The place was unchanged. In fact, it was better. It was cared for. For 6 years, someone had come here to plant, prune, and preserve the little sanctuary where they had once been happy. She sat on the wooden bench, her chest tight, staring at the still water. It was there that Ayodele found her later, having come looking for her, worried when she disappeared upstream. When he saw her sitting on that bench, in their spot, the protective armor he had been wearing dissolved completely. Morenike stood up and asked, her voice trembling, if he had been the one tending to this place all these years. Ayodele stood silent for a long time, staring at his feet. When he spoke, it was barely a whisper, saying yes, it had been him that he came there whenever the longing grew too heavy, even when he hated her or tried to hate her, because there were some things hatred could not tear out of a man, no matter how hard he tried. And there, in that hidden sanctuary, the wall of ice between them finally began to crack. And have you too ever kept a longing in your heart that time did not erase? Leave a little heart in the comments so I know you are feeling this story with me. And stay strong, because now the truth is about to emerge. From that day on, something shifted. Not all at once, not by some magic trick, but slowly, the way the dry season gives way to the rains. You barely notice until one day the air smells different, and you cannot point to the exact moment it changed. Ayodele began to appear near the mill more frequently, always with some excuse to check the sluice gate, to bring a sack of maize from his own farm to grind, to warn her of a heavy storm rolling in from the hills. Morenike pretended not to notice these pretexts, but she saw them all, and she began inventing reasons of her own to cross the bridge. They spoke little, but the silences between them stopped being silences of anger and became silences of two people who did not need words. One afternoon, during a light drizzle, Ayodele helped her carry heavy sacks of flour into the storehouse. When their fingers brushed by accident over the rough jute, Both pulled back as if burned, then laughed awkwardly, a short laugh that escaped before they could hold it back. It was the first time they had laughed together in 6 years, and the sound of it startled them both. It was a familiar sound, a sound from another time, a sound they thought they had lost forever. Morenike turned her head to hide her blushing cheeks, and Ayodele, to cover his embarrassment, made a random comment about the rain. They stood there in the doorway of the storehouse, watching the rain fall, standing too close to each other, neither having the courage to say what they truly felt. Iya Abia knew before anyone else. Iya Abia always knew. She was the oldest midwife in Odo Eye. She had helped bring almost an entire generation of that village into the world, and she used the privilege of knowing people since before they knew if they were happy or miserable to move between families without anyone questioning her. She was a tiny woman with stark white hair tied in a neat wrapper, always carrying a woven basket of medicinal herbs, with the face of someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything. She appeared at the mill doorway on a Tuesday morning, as if merely passing by, and asked Morenike for a cup of water and a place to rest her feet. Morenike did not doubt for a second that this was deliberate. Iya Abie's visits were never just about thirst and fatigue. The old woman came in, drank the water, looked at the patched rooms of the house, the sacks of flour lined up, and the tools arranged with the care of someone who respected her work. She said she was glad to see life in the house again. Then, with that serene naturalness of elders who know everything and are just waiting for the right moment, she began to speak of the old days. She spoke of Morenike's father, of her grandfather Alao, and wound her way slowly, without rush, to the name of Ayodele. Morenike went rigid, ready to steer the conversation away. But Iya Abiye raised a small, withered hand and looked her in the eye, saying she was too old to dance around the truth and there was something that needed to be said. She said she had been holding on to it for over 6 years, waiting for the right moment, and now, seeing them circling each other like moths around a flame, she believed the time had come, and so, she began to speak. On the night the enmity was born 6 years ago, Morenike was 22 and Ayodele was 26. They were betrothed by word, not yet formally blessed by the elders of the families, but everyone in the village knew they would marry. It was the most natural union in the world, the Alao Mill and the Olanrewaju lands, two estates that had complemented each other for generations. But there was also Gbadebo Okanlawan, who at the time was still establishing himself in the region, buying his first lands, and building his web of influence. Gadebo had a score to settle with old Alao, a parcel of land between the mill and the river that Morenike's father steadfastly refused to sell. Those lands were the key to the river access. Gbadebo needed to build his own mill and crush the competition. So, Gbadebo did what he did best. He planted a lie. It was simple, elegant, and cruel. He began to whisper that Ayodele was courting a young woman from Izeyin behind Morenike's back, detailing fabricated meetings, names, and dates. At the same time, he went to the old Olanrewaju patriarch and claimed that Morenike's father was speaking ill of his son in the neighboring towns, calling him weak-willed and saying his daughter deserved better. The words traveled to both sides, twisting along the way, as words always do when they pass through the wrong mouths. Old Alao, who loved his daughter with the silent, fierce devotion of fathers who never know how to say what they feel, but show it in everything they do, confronted Ayodele at the village market. Harsh words were exchanged. The Olanrewaju pride flared up in response. Ayodele, already poisoned by the rumors, believed his prospective father-in-law wanted to call off the betrothal because he deemed his family inferior. Morenike, not understanding what was happening, tried to intervene and was misunderstood by both sides at once. That very night, the fragile bond between them, delicate as all newborn things are, crumbled. Terrible things were said. The betrothal ended. The families drew a line in the dirt, and Morenike, her heart shattered and her pride bleeding, married a decent man from the city a year later and left Odo Eye, swearing never to return. What never reached her was the letter. 3 weeks after the fight, in a moment of clarity that cost him every ounce of his pride, Ayodele had written a letter to Morenike. Over 12 pages, Iya Abie swore, because she herself had seen the young man writing until dawn at his kitchen table. A letter in which he wrote that he did not understand what had happened, that he still loved her, that the things her father had heard were lies, and he wanted to know where they came from. He wrote that if he had to beg forgiveness for what he had said in the heat of anger, he would, because his love was greater than his pride. That letter had fallen into the hands of Gbadebo Okanlawan before it could reach Morenike. Gbadebo had intercepted it, bribing the young boy who delivered messages, and had burned it that very night. The story of their love turned to ash, scattered by the wind. Morenike listened to all of this in absolute silence, sitting at the edge of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if she needed to hold herself together. When Iya Abiye finished, the silence in the room was so heavy you could hear the grain dust settling on the millstones outside. Morenike asked, in a thin voice she barely recognized as her own, how Iya Abiye knew all this. The old midwife replied that the messenger boy had been her sister's youngest son, and the boy, grown now and crushed by guilt, had confessed to her before leaving to find work in Lagos. Gadebo did not know she knew, and she had kept the secret, waiting for the day when the truth could serve a purpose. A truth that arrives too early is a stray bullet, the old woman said. Morenike sat in silence long after the midwife left. Evening fell, the mill fell silent. The water kept rushing in the channel, and she remained there in the gathering dark, without lighting the lamp, mentally retracing every step of the last 6 years, every choice, every pain, every night she had hated Ayodele's name and tried to convince herself that the hatred was earned. And when the tears finally came, what she felt was not anger at Ayodele. It was rage at a lie that had stolen 6 years from them both, a lie that was still walking around the village in a clean agbada and a honeyed smile, respected as an honorable man. Her first instinct was to run to Ayodele and tell him everything, but then she remembered Iya Abiye's words. A truth that arrives too early is a stray bullet. She realized that before she told Ayodele, she needed proof. Gadebo Okanlavan was a man of wealth and connections. A mere story told by a lone woman against him, with nothing in her hands, would only make him stronger. She had to be more careful than she had ever been. She wiped her eyes, lit the kerosene lamp, and went to her father's desk drawer, where she kept the land deeds. She began to reread the documents, the dates of the deeds, the boundaries of the properties, and there, in the dry, formal lines of a deed from 1889, she found the first thread. The lands between the mill and the river, the ones her father had always refused to sell, had been transferred to Gbadebo Okanlawan's name exactly 6 months after the feud began, when her father, broken by grief and sickness, no longer had the strength to resist. The sale had been made for a pittance, signed before the registrar in Abeokuta, legal and documented. And with those lands, Gbadebo finally had what he always wanted, access to the riverbank. What he had not built yet was his own mill, because, as Morenike discovered from another document, that stretch of the river had a water limit that could only support 1 mill. As long as the Alao mill stood idle, there was water to spare, and Gbadebo could plan his own. But now that her mill was running again, Gbadebo's equation had been disrupted. And Morenike understood with a chilling clarity that the man would not simply accept this. She slept little that night, and what little she slept was a restless sleep, full of fragmented images, her brain assembled and dismantled without peace. She dreamed of the letter burning. She saw the pages of Ayodele's handwriting turning to black ash between the fingers of Gadebo Okanlawan, who smiled his silk-smooth smile as the ashes drifted away. She woke before the rooster crowed, her body stiff and her mind racing, lying in the dark, organizing what she knew and what she still needed to uncover before she acted. She must tell Ayodele, yes, but not yet. She needed more proof. She needed the messenger boy, now a grown man in Lagos. She needed, above all, to understand how Gbadebo would move now that the mill was back in business. Gbadebo's response did not take long. 4 days later, on a morning when Morenike opened her window and smelled a strange scent in the air, she went down to the mill and found the water channel blocked. It was not a natural accumulation of leaves and branches. It was a barrier of large rocks placed there deliberately, with care and malice. Someone had gone there in the dead of night and choked the water flow. The mill wheel was still. On the base of the largest rock, there was a mark Morenike recognized. It was the way Gbadebo marked the boundary stones of his properties, a carved letter G, too discreet to be legal proof, but too visible to be an accident. She stood looking at it for a long time, hands on her hips, anger rising in her chest. She went to fetch her shovel and began to haul the rocks out. It was a 2-person job, she knew, and would take 3 times as long, but she was clearing the 3rd stone when she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned, Ayodele was there with Babatunde. They climbed down the bank, and without a word, the 2 began to help. The 3 of them worked in silence for over 2 hours until the channel was clear and the water resumed its flow. When they finished, Ayodele stood looking at the pile of stones they had removed, and said in a low voice that this was no accident. Morenike agreed it was not. He asked if she had any idea who did it. She said she had a suspicion, but needed to be certain before she spoke. Ayodele looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he knew there were more things being said in that silence than words could reach, and told her that if she ever needed help, she only had to ask. Morenike felt in that moment that the bridge between them was not just patched, it was being rebuilt, stone by stone, over the water that had always flowed between them. In the days that followed, Morenike watched Gadebo Okanlawan's movements with a vigilance she disguised as indifference. She knew he stopped every Thursday at Baba Akin's shop to go over accounts and share palm wine with the local elders. She knew he had a young clerk, a boy named Kunle, who copied his documents and was in love with the blacksmith's daughter. And she knew, from something Babatunde let slip during a chat about the channel, that Gadebo had visited Ayodele twice in the last few months, offering to buy a tract of Olanrewaju land that bordered the lands he already owned. The pieces were fitting together in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was Babatunde again who, without realizing it, opened the most important window. One afternoon, while helping unload maize at the mill, the old manager mentioned, in the casual way of someone talking about the weather, that years ago, when the trouble between the families first started, Master Ayodele had hired a lawyer in Abeokuta to investigate, because he could not believe old Alao was capable of the things they said he had said. He said the lawyer had come close to finding something, but Gadebo had advised Ayodele to drop it, saying digging up the past would only bring more pain, and Ayodele, exhausted and bitter, had given up. Morenike listened, her stomach turning. Gadebo had buried the truth twice, and he was still standing there, smiling. That week, she made her decision. She wrote a letter to Lagos, to the address Iya Abie had given her, to the sister's son, Kunle. She explained who she was. She said there was no judgment, that she only needed the truth, that the lie in this matter had already done too much damage, and the one who deserved judgment was another. She gave the letter to a trusted trader, the one who took mail to the train terminal twice a week, and waited. While she waited, she kept working, grinding the farmers' crops, and kept interacting with Ayodele, that sweet, dangerous closeness they had built over the ruins of their past. There was one afternoon, a single afternoon, when Morenike could not keep the distance she imposed on herself. She was repairing one of the wooden gears under the mill wheel, lying on her back in the dark with her tools scattered around her, when a wooden peg she was trying to fit slipped and she lost it in the shadows. She lay there for a moment, her arm raised in the empty air, and that was when she felt Ayodele's hand. He had arrived without her noticing, reach for the peg on the dark ground and place it in her palm. His fingers lingered a second longer than necessary, wrapping around hers. When Morenike crawled out from under the wheel and stood up, their faces were very close, too close. His eyes held that expression she knew from long ago, the look of someone looking at his own home after a long journey. She stepped back slowly, saying something about the gear. He answered something about the sun being low, and neither of them said what truly needed to be said, but Morenike's heart beat wildly for the rest of the day, and she stopped lying to herself that she felt nothing. The reply from Lagos arrived 18 days later, in a folded envelope stained by the journey. Kunle wrote that he knew this day would come, and he was prepared. He confirmed everything. He said Gbadebo Okanlawan himself had handed him the letter, along with a generous sum of silver shillings and a quiet threat that things would go badly for his family if he did not comply. He said he was very young at the time, and fear had won, and he had carried that guilt like a stone around his neck ever since. He said he was willing to put it in writing, with the date and details, signed and stamped by a magistrate in Lagos, if Morenike needed it, and begged her forgiveness, though he knew forgiveness was little for the damage done. Morenike read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, slipped it into her pocket, and walked down to the pool in the clearing. She stood looking at the water for a long time, listening to the wind in the savannah, smelling the damp earth. Then she went home, lit the lamp, and wrote late into the night. When she finished, she held a summary of everything she knew, along with the land deeds, Kunle's letter, and the dates she had gathered from the registrar's archives in Abeokuta, where she had gone 2 days prior, on a vague pretext, spending hours pretending to look for something else while memorizing what mattered. It was a cohesive, documented story, and it was the truth. Only one thing was missing. She had to tell Ayodele before making any move, because this was their story, and he had the right to know before anyone else. She chose a Sunday morning, when she knew Ayodele walked alone along the riverbank before church. She went to meet him, the papers in a leather bag, her heart in her throat, her steps firm. She found him exactly where she expected, standing on the bank, skipping stones across the water, with the distracted air of a man deep in thought. He saw her approach and stood still, without his usual defensive posture, simply waiting. She sat on the grass beside him and said she had something to tell him, that it would take time, that it was difficult, and she asked him to listen to the end before saying anything. He nodded, and she told him everything from the beginning. The lands Gbadebo wanted, the lies planted on both sides, the letter he had written that never reached her because it was intercepted and burned, Kunle, the money, the threat, the land deeds, and the lawyer Gbadebo had turned away. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice steady for the most part, breaking only once or twice when she could not help it. Ayodele listened in absolute silence, never interrupting her, his hands resting on his knees when she spoke of the letter, and sitting completely still when she spoke of the bribe and the boy. When she finished, there was a silence the river was not enough to fill. Ayodele spoke first. He said, in the deep, controlled voice of a man holding back an avalanche of emotion, that he had spent 6 years believing her father had gone to the market solely to humiliate him, and he had started each day hating that memory, and ended each day unable to understand how something so ugly could exist within a family he had known to be good. He said that when Morenike left, he had stood in the middle of his compound for he did not know how long, staring at the road, and the part that hurt most was not the fight, but not knowing what was true, and now he knew. He stood up, turning his back to her for a moment, his shoulders tense, and when he turned around, Morenike saw in his eyes a combination of things she had never seen in the same place at the same time: fury, relief, and the first tear he had shed in many years, which he wiped away quickly with the back of his hand, almost embarrassed. She reached her hand out to him. He looked at it for a second, that open hand offered on the riverbank, and took it. They said nothing else for a while. They did not need to. 6 years of enmity had been built on a lie, and that lie now lay exposed between them in all its ugliness. What came next was no longer about the past. It was about what they would do with what they held in their hands. Now, if you have been following this story up to this point, leave a comment telling me what you would do in their place. Would you confront the man who planted the lie, or would you let it be? I want to know what you think. Ayodele said they needed a plan, that confronting Gbadebo Okanlavon directly without a strategy was like throwing the truth into the mud and watching it sink. The man had influence, money, connections with registrars, merchants, and local chiefs. They had to be cleverer than he had been. Morenike agreed, but added that they could not wait too long, because men like Gbadebo did not rest when they lost control of the narrative. She knew, from the signs she had observed, that he was already uneasy about the mill's operation and their growing closeness. It was only a matter of time before he made a more aggressive move. They had a small window and had to use it well. It was Ayodele who suggested they go to Pastor Samuel. The pastor was a man of about 60, a son of the soil who had baptized half that generation, and though he remained discreet in local disputes, he held the respect of everyone in the village, regardless of wealth or family name. If anyone could mediate a meeting involving the two families without it devolving into violence, it was him. Morenike agreed it made sense, but before they went to the pastor, she said they had to ensure that Kunle, the messenger boy, would be willing to come to Odo Eye if necessary and confirm the truth in person, because papers could be disputed, but a man standing tall, looking people in the eye, and speaking the truth, was a different thing entirely. They sent a message to Kunle that same afternoon via the train terminal. The confirmation arrived 2 days later. He would come. They set the meeting for the following week. In the meantime, Morenike and Ayodele had to go about their daily routines without raising suspicion. They worked together on the channel, talked of small things, maize, rain, the price of crops, and avoided naming what was growing between them, because that, though the most important thing, was also the most dangerous to speak of before the past was truly laid to rest. But their glances lingered, their hands brushed more often than chance would dictate, and anyone watching them closely would know that something was being rebuilt, brick by brick. Babatunde was the first to notice. The old manager had eyes trained to read what people kept hidden. One morning, while helping Ayodele repair a fence, he remarked with that fatherly wisdom only elders possess, that it was good to see the master laughing again, that it had been years since he saw that spark in his eye. Ayodele stopped working, looked at his manager, and confessed with rare honesty that he was afraid that all of this, the reconciliation, the truth, was too late. He said 6 years was a long time, that Morenike had been married to another man, had lived a life he did not know, and perhaps what they had before was just a youthful dream that did not fit who they were now. Babatunde listened, spat on the red earth as he always did before saying something important, and replied, "A love that survives 6 years of lies and still grows in the midst of anger is no youthful dream. It is the truth. If you let it slip away again, you will regret it for the rest of your days." Those words weighed on Ayodele all day. It was during that week that the fire happened. On a night of a full moon, Morenike woke to the smell of smoke. She ran to the window and saw, her heart hammering, that the storehouse next to the mill was on fire. The flames were licking the thatch roof, and the wind was blowing toward her house. She ran out screaming, barefoot, a bucket in hand, trying to draw water from the well, but it was impossible to fight the blaze alone. The fire grew rapidly, fed by the dry timber, the sacks of flour, and the wind that seemed to conspire against her. Then they appeared, running across the bridge, Ayodele, Babatunde, and 2 of his farmhands, carrying buckets, wet blankets, shouting instructions to one another. They worked for hours until their hands were scorched and their lungs burned from the smoke, and when they finally put out the last ember, dawn was breaking, and the storehouse was nothing but charred wood and ash. Morenike sat on the ground, covered in soot, trembling, and that was when she saw what was written on the only remaining outer wall, scrawled in charcoal before the fire was lit. Sell. The message was clear. Gbadebo Okanlawan was losing his patience. Ayodele saw the word at the same time, and his face filled with a quiet, dangerous fury that was far more terrifying than any outburst. He said, in a low, cold voice, that this had gone too far. It was no longer about land or the mill, but about her safety, and he would handle it, whatever the cost. Morenike grabbed his arm tightly and said no, they would not act on impulse, as that was exactly what Gbadebo wanted. He wanted them to act rashly, to create more chaos, giving him the chance to twist the narrative again. They had a plan, and they must stick to it. Ayodele took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and agreed. But when he opened them and looked at her, there was a fierce determination in his gaze. He would not let anything happen to her, not again. Pastor Samuel received them in the vestry of the stone chapel on a Thursday afternoon, after the evening service. He was a tall, thin man in a worn black cassock, with clear eyes that seemed to see deeper than what people showed. He listened to everything Morenike and Ayodele had to say without interrupting, his hands clasped on the dark wooden table. He read Kunle's letter, examined the copies of the land deeds, studied the dates, the values, the names. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long time, then let out a deep sigh, the sigh of a man weary of human malice, but not surprised by it. The pastor said he knew Gbadebo Okanlawan well enough to know he was capable of this, and worse. He said over the years he had heard confessions, witnessed deals, and seen schemes where Gbadebo always managed to stand outside the blame but at the center of the profit. He said confronting him privately would be difficult because he was skilled at twisting accusations, using the law to his advantage, buying witnesses, and silencing voices. But there was one thing men like him could not stand: losing their mask before the community they deceived. He said if Gbadebo were exposed not in a private room, but before the very people he needed to impress to maintain his power, his downfall would be inevitable. He suggested they do it publicly, with Kunle present, before the respected elders and families of the village, at a moment when Gbadebo could not escape without exposing himself. It was decided they would do this at the monthly meeting of the Church Council of St. Jude, which took place in the church square and gathered the prominent men and women of the region to discuss parish works, charity, and community matters. Gbadebo never missed these meetings because it was there that he built his image as a generous and upright citizen. The pastor offered to lead the meeting in such a way that, at a certain point, Morenike could ask for the floor and present her case. It would not be a court of law, but it would be a moral judgment, and sometimes the latter cuts deeper. They set the meeting for the following month. Kunle confirmed he would be there. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, Morenike and Ayodele lived in constant tension, but it was a tension they shared, and it only drew them closer. They worked side by side, rebuilding the scorched storehouse, and there were moments when they stopped, sweaty and tired, and looked at each other with a silent understanding that went far beyond their labor. During one of those moments, Ayodele asked out of nowhere if she remembered the first time they had kissed. Morenike stopped, hammer in hand, and replied yes, she remembered. It had been by the pool in the clearing, under a blooming yellow cassia, on a September afternoon. He smiled a slightly crooked, shy smile, and said it was the most beautiful memory of his entire life, and he had spent 6 years trying to forget it without succeeding for a single day. Morenike felt her chest tighten. She said, in a low voice, that she had not forgotten either that she had tried, had married a good man in an attempt to erase it, but it had remained clung to her like skin to bone. Ayodele stepped toward her. She did not draw back. He raised his hand slowly and touched her cheek with the tips of his fingers, as if touching something precious he was afraid to break. Morenike closed her eyes, and for a single second, the world stopped spinning. He whispered, asking if she thought there was still time. She opened her eyes and said she did not know if there was time, but she wanted to find out. And it was she who closed the distance between them. It was she who kissed him, with the same courage she brought to everything else in life. The kiss tasted of both the past and the future, and when they parted, both were trembling. Ayodele held her face in his hands and said that no matter what happened at the meeting, whether Gbadebo fell or not, he would not lose her again. He said if she wished, he would wait as long as necessary, but he wanted to try again, to be the man she deserved, and he would do everything differently this time. Morenike, her eyes filled with tears that this time were of joy, replied that she did not need impossible promises. She only needed him, just as he was, imperfect and true. They stood there, holding each other in the middle of the half-rebuilt storehouse, rebuilding something far greater than walls. The news that Morenike and Ayodele were speaking and working together spread through the village like wildfire. Tongues wagged again, but this time the murmurs were different. Some felt it was a disgrace, that the families should keep their distance, that 6 years of bitter feud could not be wiped away so easily. But there were others more than Morenike expected who said it was about time, that the feud had never made sense, that they had always belonged to each other, and only the blind could not see it. Iya Abie walked through the village with a knowing smile, like someone who had planted a seed and was now watching the shoot break through the soil. Gbadebo Okanlawon, on the other hand, was not smiling. He had eyes and ears everywhere and knew exactly what was happening. He tried one last time, finding Morenike at Baba Akin's shop, to offer to buy the mill. This time, the price was double what he had offered before, and he used every beautiful word in his vocabulary. He spoke of her future, her safety, and sparing her from back-breaking labor. Morenike listened with a calm that was almost terrifying, and replied in a clear voice so everyone in the shop could hear, "My father's mill is not for sale. It never has been, and you can keep your money, because I would not sell it to you for 3 times that amount." Gbadebo smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and when he left the shop, his stride was that of a man who knew he was losing the game. The meeting of the Church Council of St. Jude took place on a Saturday afternoon in the parish hall beside the chapel, the windows wide open to the smell of fresh coffee being brewed by the churchwomen. The hall was packed with local farmers, merchants, respected elders, the village registrar, the local teacher, everyone who mattered in Odo Eye and the surrounding settlements. Gbadebo Okanlawon arrived early, impeccably dressed, greeting everyone with practiced warmth, handshakes, and smiles. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. Morenike arrived, accompanied by Ayodele, and their entrance together brought a sudden silence over the room, the kind of silence that falls when people see something they did not expect, but which makes perfect sense. They sat side by side in the 3rd row, Morenike holding a leather folder containing the documents she had compiled. Kunle, the messenger, sat quietly at the back, a modest man in a simple suit whom no one in the village recognized. Pastor Samuel led the meeting, starting with the usual matters, repairing the chapel roof, collecting alms for the needy, and organizing the upcoming patron saint festival. When the agenda was nearly finished, he announced there was an important matter one of those present wished to bring before the gathering, and invited Morenike to stand. She stood up, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. She looked at Ayodele, who gave her a quiet nod of encouragement, and began to speak. She said she had a story to tell that concerned the entire community, because it was about justice, truth, and the kind of people they wished to be. She said that for 6 years, she and the Olanrewaju family had lived in enmity. Everyone knew it because the whole village had taken sides and suffered from the division. But she had now discovered the source of that enmity, and it was not what they believed. The hall fell into absolute silence. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Morenike told everything. She spoke of the lands her father had refused to sell, of Gbadebo Okanlawon's desire for those lands to build his own mill and control the river. She spoke of the lies planted on both sides, the falsehoods told to her father and to Ayodele, designed to breed hatred where there had been love. She spoke of the letter Ayodele had written, filled with love and a plea for reconciliation, which never reached her because it was intercepted and burned. Then, she invited Kunle to stand. The man stood up, pale but resolute, and confirmed everything. He stated his name and declared that, at 15 years old, he had handed Ayodele's letter to Gbadebo Okanlawon in exchange for money and under threat. He said he had carried that guilt for years and was there to speak the truth, whatever the cost. He showed his signed statement, certified by a magistrate in Lagos, with the dates and details. The room erupted in whispers. Faces turned toward Gbadebo, who sat in the front row, his face turning crimson, his fists clenched on his knees. Morenike then took the copies of the land deeds and passed them around. She pointed out the dates. She showed how her father's lands had been sold for next to nothing, right after the feud began, when her father was sick and broken. She laid bare the entire calculated, cold scheme. She said Gbadebo Okanlawon had destroyed 2 families, divided a community, and stolen 6 years of her and Ayodele's lives out of pure greed. And she stood there not to demand vengeance, but so the truth would be known, so everyone would know exactly who they were dealing with. Gbadebo leaped to his feet, his face contorted with rage, shouting that it was a lie, a conspiracy, that Morenike and Ayodele were inventing this to slander him. But his voice sounded desperate, and the more he shouted, the more he exposed himself. Pastor Samuel called for order, asking Gbadebo to answer the charges calmly if he had answers. Gbadebo tried, claiming the boy was lying, the dates were coincidences, and he had bought the lands honestly. But when the registrar stood up and confirmed that indeed the lands had been sold under highly suspicious circumstances, and even he had found it strange at the time, Gbadebo's defense collapsed. Others began to speak. The blacksmith said Gbadebo had offered him money years ago to spread rumors about the Olanrewajus. A local innkeeper said she had seen Gbadebo talking to the messenger boy around the time the letter disappeared. Small pieces people had kept to themselves, things that seemed odd but had never been linked came to light, like pulling a single thread until the whole garment unravels. Gbadebo tried to leave, but the pastor asked him to remain, and the moral weight of that request, made before the entire community, held him in place. He stood there, trembling with anger and fear, watching everything he had built crumble. Pastor Samuel, with the quiet authority of the truly just, said the church council was not a court of law, but they were a body of faithful, principled people, and lies, manipulation, and the destruction of families had no place among them. He declared that Gbadebo Okanlawon was suspended from the council until he made amends, which included returning the dishonestly acquired lands or paying a fair price for them, apologizing publicly, and rebuilding the trust he had broken. The entire hall murmured in agreement. Gbadebo tried to speak, but no sound came. He looked around, saw only closed, disappointed faces, and understood he had lost. He walked out of the hall without another word, and when the door shut behind him, it felt as though a great weight had been lifted from everyone. What happened next was something Morenike had not expected. People began to stand up, one by one, to come to her and Ayodele. They apologized for believing the lies, for feeding the division, for not questioning things sooner. Iabie came with shining eyes and embraced Morenike tightly, saying she was proud. Old Babatunde shook Ayodele's hand and said his master had done the right thing. Slowly, in that hall, the village that had been torn in half began to mend. Not perfectly, because these things are never perfect, but with the honesty of those who admit their mistakes and want to put them right. That night, Morenike and Ayodele walked back home together along the dirt road, lit by the full moon. They did not speak much, for there was a good exhaustion in their silence, the exhaustion of those who had fought and won. When they reached the bridge that separated their properties, Ayodele stopped and said he no longer wanted there to be a bridge. He wanted all of it to be one place, hers and his, without divisions. Morenike smiled and said she wanted that too. And there, on the bridge under the starlit sky, they kissed again, but this time, without fear, without rush, with the certainty that time now belonged to them. In the weeks that followed, things fell into place. Gbadebo Okanlawon, ruined and stripped of his influence, did as the pastor demanded. He returned the lands he had acquired dishonestly, or rather, sold them back to Morenike for the same pittance he had paid. Shortly after, he left Odo Eye, and no one saw him again. Some said he went to Lagos. Others said he fled to Oyo town to try to start over far from his tarnished name. Morenike did not care. The important thing was that he was gone. With the lands recovered, the mill and the Olanrewaju estate were finally joined. Ayodele proposed they expand the mill, build a second channel, and plant more maize on his lands to grind in her mill. Morenike agreed. They worked side by side for months, and what had begun as an agreement became a partnership, and the partnership became a shared life so natural that when Ayodele, during an afternoon of work, stopped and asked her to marry him, Morenike's answer was as simple as it was true: yes. They married in a small ceremony in the same stone chapel where the truth had come to light, with Pastor Samuel officiating and half the village present. Morenike wore a lace buba and iro that Iya Abiye had helped sew, and Ayodele, in a fine hand-woven agbada, had the look in his eyes of a man who knew he was receiving more than he deserved and was grateful for every second of it. When they exchanged vows, there were tears in many eyes, because that marriage belonged to more than just two people. It was the union of two families that had been enemies and were now one. It was the healing of a wound that had bled for 6 years. The years that followed were of hard work, but true happiness. The mill prospered, the farm grew. Morenike and Ayodele built a life that blended the best of both worlds: her strength, his patience, and the determination of both. They had disagreements, as all couples do, but they never again let pride speak louder than love. They learned that the truth, however difficult to speak, is always better than a lie, no matter how comfortable the lie might seem. 5 years after their wedding, on a morning when the savannah was in full bloom and the air smelled of damp earth, Morenike woke with a strange feeling. She rose quietly so as not to wake Ayodele, who was still sleeping, and went to the window. Outside, the mill wheel turned with that steady rhythm she had learned to love. The water ran clear in the channel, and the yellow cassias they had planted around the clearing were in full bloom, a burst of gold against the blue sky. She placed her hand on her belly, still flat, but feeling a change her body recognized before her mind did. She smiled to herself. She would tell Ayodele later, when she was certain, but she already knew. The months that followed were a time of quiet anticipation. Ayodele grew anxious in the way men do when they are about to become fathers, wanting to build a perfect wooden crib, remodeling the room, protecting Morenike from any heavy labor even when she insisted she was fine. Iya Abiye, now nearly 70 but still active as a midwife, visited every week, bringing herbal teas, offering advice, and laughing that laugh of someone who had seen generations born and knew that life always finds a way. The baby was born on a hot December morning, when summer had arrived in full force, and the cicadas were singing in the she-nut trees. It was a difficult labor, as many are, but Morenike was strong and Iya Abiye had experienced hands. When the baby's cry finally echoed through the house, Ayodele, who had been pacing outside like a caged lion, fell to his knees on the earth and wept with relief. It was a little girl, perfect, with strong lungs and the crumpled face of a newborn. They named her Aduke, after Morenike's mother. Seeing Ayodele with his daughter in his arms was a sight to warm any heart. He, who had always been a man of few words and great seriousness, melted when the girl looked at him, and spent hours rocking her, singing quiet lullabies he had learned from his own mother. Morenike watched him and felt a gratitude so immense, she often had to stop what she was doing just to take a deep breath and thank everything she had gone through. Because without the pain of the past, without the 6 years of separation, without the fight for the truth, perhaps she would not have known how to recognize the depth of the happiness she held now. Aduke grew quickly, as children of the countryside do, surrounded by fresh air, honest labor, and the love of two families that had learned that unity is worth more than pride. By 5, she was already following her father around the farm, helping her mother at the mill, and every Sunday going with them to the chapel, where Pastor Samuel, now very old but still clear-minded, blessed her with the smile of someone who saw the fruit of the good he had sown. Babatunde, who had grown old and no longer worked the fields, would sit on the veranda, watching the girl play, and tell anyone who cared to listen that this child was proof that God writes straight with crooked lines. Iya Abiye, who had finally retired her midwife's bag, visited often, bringing sweet milk curds and telling old stories that made Aduke laugh and reminded Morenike and Ayodele of all they had lived through. But this story is not about Aduke. It is about her parents, about Morenike and Ayodele, about the mill that was nearly lost and was saved, about the lands that were nearly stolen and were recovered, about the love that nearly died and was reborn stronger. Because in the end, that is what happened in Odo Eye. Two people who loved each other had that love stolen by a lie, and it took them 6 years to find the truth. 6 years of hatred, of silence, of closed doors, of an enmity that divided families and tore a village in half. And when the truth finally came to light, when Gbadebo Okanlawon was unmasked and driven away, when the documents were shown and the witnesses spoke, what remained was not vengeance. It was forgiveness, it was rebuilding, It was the conscious choice not to let the past poison the future. Morenike and Ayodele could have remained trapped in that hatred for the rest of their lives, feeding their grudges and passing them down to their children like a cursed inheritance. But they chose differently. They chose to believe that 6 lost years did not mean all the years to follow had to be lost as well. And that is why their story became a legend in the region, not because it was perfect, but because it was true, showing that love, when it is real, endures. It endures lies. It endures time. It even endures hatred. And the greatest courage is not to fight, but to forgive, to offer an open hand when it would be easier to clench a fist, to choose the truth even when the lie is more comfortable. Years later, when Morenike and Ayodele were old, their hair white and their hands lined with the labor of a lifetime, they loved to sit on the veranda at the end of the day, with Aduke, now grown and living in her own home with her own family, and watch the mill wheel turn. The water wheel never stopped, and the channel never ran dry. And every time someone new arrived in Odoeye and asked about those lands, about that well-tended mill, or the story of that family, the elders of the village would tell it. They would tell of the young woman who returned alone to rebuild what her father had left. They would tell of the farmer who opened the sluice gate even though he was an enemy, because in his heart he had never stopped loving her. They would tell of the greedy merchant who tried to destroy 2 families to steal their lands and ended up losing everything. They would tell of the letter that never arrived, of the lies that were planted, of the truth that was discovered, and they would say with a smile that this story of Morenike and Ayodele was the most beautiful love story the region had ever known, because it had been hidden for 6 long years behind an enmity that should never have existed. And when it was finally uncovered, when it finally came to light, it was so strong, so true, and so full of life that no one doubted for a single second that it had been worth the wait, worth the fight, and worth believing that love, even when buried, even when trampled, even when left for dead, can rise again. And every time a new couple married in the stone chapel of Odoeye, the pastor, whoever he might be, for Pastor Samuel had passed away long ago, would tell the story of Morenike and Ayodele. He told it as an example, as a lesson, to remind them that marriage is not just about the good days, but also the bad days, the misunderstandings, the fights, the bruised pride. But if there is truth, if there is forgiveness, if there is true love, one can cross anything, even 6 years of hatred. Morenike died first, at 73, on a peaceful autumn afternoon, sleeping in the hammock on the veranda, her hand held tightly in Ayodele's. He followed her 6 months later, as often happens to those who have loved truly and do not wish to be left behind. They were buried side by side in the village cemetery, under a yellow cassia tree that blooms every year. And on the simple stone headstone, beneath their names and dates, was a phrase Aduke had carved: separated by lies, united by truth, together forever. The mill kept running, passed down from generation to generation. And even today, if you go to Odoeye, which is now larger, more modern, but still keeps that countryside spirit that time cannot erase, you will hear the sound of the water wheel turning. You will see the stone channel where the water runs clear. And if you ask, someone will tell you the story. Because stories like this do not die. They live on the lips of the people, passed from grandparent to grandchild, becoming part of the earth, part of the air, part of the identity of a place. Every time someone is going through a hard time in their marriage, or holding a grudge against someone they love, or thinking of giving up because pride is shouting louder than the heart, the elders of Odoeye give the same advice. Remember the story of Morenike and Ayodele? Remember that 6 years were lost to a lie that neither of them told. Remember that if they had spoken sooner, if they had found the courage to ask instead of believing what others said, perhaps none of that would have happened. But remember also that when the truth finally appeared, they grabbed it with both hands. They did not sit mourning the lost time. They did not blame themselves. They simply started again, with the honesty of those who know that the time remaining is more important than the time that has passed. And together they built a life that was worth living, a life that even today, decades later, still inspires us. So, if you are listening to this story, and if deep in your heart you are holding a grudge, or a pride that will not yield, or a word that needs to be spoken but you are afraid to say it, think of Morenike and Ayodele. Think of the 6 years they lost, and decide whether you want to lose yours as well, or if you will have the courage they found in the end. The courage to choose the truth, even when it hurts. The courage to choose love, even when anger seems easier. Because in the end, we only take from this life what we loved, and what we did with that love. And the most beautiful story is not the one that never had a problem, but the one that faced a problem and found a solution, that had pain but found healing, that had separation but found reunion. The most beautiful love story of Odo Eye was indeed hidden behind 6 years of enmity. But when it was found, it shone brighter than any other, and it continues to shine today. Every time someone tells it, every time someone hears it, every time someone decides to believe that true love, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way back to the surface. And so ends the story of Morenike Alao and Ayodele Olanrewaju. Two people who loved, lost, and found each other again, who fought for the truth, conquered the lie, and left a legacy that crossed generations, a legacy not of land, nor of the mill, nor of wealth. It was a legacy of love, of true love, the kind that endures everything, including time. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that such love still exists, leave a like below, subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late for truth and love. May God be with you until the next story, because I remain here telling the tales of old, the ones that teach us that the past always has something to say to the present, if we only have ears to listen. But before I finish, let me tell you a few more details of this story, because there are things that happened along the way that are worth remembering, details that show how true love reveals itself, not in grand gestures, but in the small choices of everyday life. When Morenike and Ayodele found each other again after 6 years, there was a distance between them that was not just of space, but of experiences lived separately, of pains each carried alone, of versions of themselves the other did not know. Morenike had been married, had been widowed, and had learned to survive on her own, in a big city where no one knew her name. Ayodele had remained on the farm, had cared for his aging father until the end, and had taken on responsibilities that weighed on his shoulders in a way she had not seen. They were two different people from the ones who had parted. In the first months of their coexistence, after the water returned to the channel, they had to relearn each other, and that was not easy. There were moments when Morenike thought she was being foolish, trying to revive something that might have been only an illusion of youth. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if it would not be better to accept that the past belonged to the past, and move on alone. And there were certainly moments when Ayodele also doubted, moments when he looked at her and saw a woman he did not fully know, wondering if what he felt was love or merely the longing for what could have been. But it was in the small gestures that the truth showed itself, in the way Ayodele always arrived when she needed him most, without her having to ask. The way Morenike saved a piece of steamed corn pudding she knew he liked, even when she was too tired to cook. The way the two, working side by side in the channel, developed a private language of glances and nods, where a raised eyebrow meant careful, and a corner smile meant all is well. There was also the weight of what their families had lived through, because it was not only Morenike and Ayodele who had been affected by the enmity. It was cousins, uncles, dependents, an entire network of people who for 6 years had been taught to look to the other side of the bridge with suspicion. And when the truth came to light, when Gbadebo was exposed, it was not automatic that everyone simply forgot. There was resistance. There were those who felt that even if the origin of the fight had been a lie, the insults hurled over those years, the closed doors, the snubbed greetings, all of that was too real to be simply brushed away. It took time, it took patience, it took Morenike and Ayodele together, showing by example that it was possible to forgive. They began slowly, inviting their families for Sunday dinners. First, just the closest relatives, then widening the circle. In the beginning, it was uncomfortable. There were heavy silences, sideways glances, and those who ate quickly and left early. But slowly, as the weeks turned into months, the ice melted. The children of both families, who did not understand the adults' feud, began to play together. The elders, tired of carrying grudges, began to let go. And during one of those dinners, almost a year after Gbadebo's exposure, something happened that no one expected. Uncle Babajide, the youngest brother of Morenike's father, a man with a white mustache and a difficult temper, who had sworn never to step onto Olanrewaju land, again arrived carrying a bottle of aromatic schnapps and offered it to Ayodele. He said, with an emotional voice, that he had spent 6 years hating a man who did not deserve hatred, and he apologized. Ayodele gripped the old man's hand tightly, and the two stood there, two men whom life had taught to hide their feelings, holding that handshake longer than necessary, because it was more than a handshake. It was a pact of peace. And it was after that day that the entire village understood the reconciliation was real, that it was not theater, not convenience, but a true transformation. And the people, one by one, laid aside the old versions of the story and began to build a new one where the two families were not enemies, but allies. Morenike, during this time, discovered things about Ayodele she had not known. She discovered he had a habit of waking before the sun and walking to the river just to watch the day break, saying it was the moment when God felt closest. She discovered he was afraid of severe storms, something he had never admitted when they were young, and that on thunderous nights he grew restless, checking the shutters and the livestock as if he needed to be certain everything was secure. She discovered he wrote, not well, he admitted, but he wrote in old notebooks, scattered thoughts, broken verses, things he never showed to anyone, until one afternoon, without Morenike asking, he gave her one of the notebooks. She read it and wept, because it was all there, the 6 years of longing, of misunderstanding, of pain, and there too, written in his uneven hand, was the moment he saw her return, and how that had been both the hardest and most necessary thing in his life. Ayodele, in turn, discovered that Morenike had scars he did not know, not just physical ones, from hands calloused by labor, but internal ones. He discovered that her marriage to the other man had been respectful but cold, that she had been treated with politeness, never with passion, spending years playing the role of a wife without ever feeling truly seen. And when her husband died of a sudden fever, she had wept more out of relief than sorrow, and she carried guilt for that. Ayodele listened without judgment, held her hand, and said she did not need to carry guilt for being honest with her own feelings, that living a lifetime pretending was worse than admitting that sometimes things are not as we would wish. Those moments of vulnerability, those late-night conversations when the world slept and only the two of them were awake, were the bricks that rebuilt what had been broken. Because the love of youth is easy, light, and full of illusion, protected by ignorance of how life can hurt. But the love of people who have already been hurt, who have lost, who have stumbled, that love is different. It is heavier, more conscious, more fragile, and at the same time, stronger. Because it is a choice, not just a feeling. It is the daily decision to stay, even when it hurts, even when it would be easier to walk away. And Morenike and Ayodele made that choice every single day. On the good days, when the mill ran perfectly, the harvest was plentiful, the sun shone, and it seemed everything had finally fallen into place. But especially on the bad days, when the rains were late, the grain spoiled, money was tight, and patience ran thin. On those days, when the temptation was to throw something from the past in each other's face, some old accusation, they took a deep breath and remembered what they had promised each other, that they would not let pride win again. There was an argument about 2 years after they married that nearly broke everything again. It was over a decision about the lands, whether they should sell a parcel to clear a debt or hold on to it and tighten their belts. Ayodele wanted to sell, Morenike wanted to hold. Both were stubborn, both had good arguments, and neither wanted to yield. The argument escalated. Voices were raised, harsh words were said, and at one point, Ayodele, his voice thick with frustration, said that perhaps she did not trust him, because deep down she still believed he was to blame for the fight 6 years ago. Morenike froze. That accusation hurt, because it touched a wound she thought had healed, but which was still tender. She could have struck back with the same coin, throwing his own insecurities in his face. But instead, she stopped, took a breath, and said in a controlled but firm voice that it was not about trust, that she trusted him more than she trusted anyone else in the world. She said that having different opinions did not mean a lack of trust. It meant they were two complete people, each with their own mind, and if they were to stay together, they needed to learn to disagree without turning every disagreement into a war. Ayodele listened, and after a long silence, apologized. He said he had been unfair, that he was tired and frustrated, and had thrown that at her knowing it would hurt. Morenike apologized as well for being unyielding, and together, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee between them, they found a third way: to sell half the parcel, keep the other half, tighten their belts, but not so much as to suffocate. And they emerged from that argument more united than they had entered, because they had learned they could fight without destroying each other. These small victories, these small choices to stay instead of leave, to speak instead of remain silent, to forgive instead of harboring resentment, were what made their marriage not just survive, but flourish. And the village saw it, saw in them an example of what a relationship could be when built not only on feeling, but on mutual respect, honest communication, and a genuine will to make it work. And when Aduk was born and they held her for the first time, they both felt the same thing, that this child was the living symbol that everything had been worth it. Every tear shed, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, all of it had been necessary to arrive here. And they vowed, without needing to say it aloud because each knew the other was thinking the same thing, that they would raise this girl in a home where the truth was more important than appearances, where forgiveness was stronger than pride, and where love was shown not only in words, but in deeds. Aduke grew up watching her parents work together, seeing her mother repairing the mill with greasy hands and a sweaty brow, and her father respecting that, never saying it was a man's job, seeing her father cooking when her mother was tired, and her mother never saying he was invading her space. She grew up seeing them disagree, sometimes with raised voices, but always ending the discussion, holding hands, always apologizing when they were wrong, always showing that fighting did not mean they stopped loving. And when Aduke, as a young girl, asked one day why the grandparents of the two families had been enemies, Morenike and Ayodele told her the truth. They spared no details. They told her of Gabadebo Okanlawon, of the lie, of the burned letter, of the 6 lost years. And when Aduke asked how they had managed to forgive all of that, Morenike replied that it had not been easy, that there were still days when she thought of those 6 years and felt a sting of sadness for the lost time, but she had learned that holding on to resentment was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, that the only way to move forward was by letting go of the past. Not forgetting, because forgetting would be dishonest, but letting go of the anger, the grudge, the desire for revenge. Ayodele added that forgiving was not just about forgiving the other person, it was about forgiving oneself as well. Forgiving oneself for believing the lies, for not questioning sooner, for letting pride speak louder than the heart. And when he finally managed to do that, when he could look in the mirror and tell himself he had made a mistake but was trying to correct it, that was when he truly became free. Aduke listened carefully, and when her parents finished, she said something that surprised them. She said she was grateful for everything that had happened, because if not for the lie, if not for the separation, perhaps her parents would not value what they had so much. Perhaps they would have settled, thinking love was automatic, letting small bad things accumulate without solving them. But because they had lost and recovered, they knew the value of what they held. That made them better parents, better people. Morenike and Ayodele looked at each other when they heard that, realizing that their daughter, with the wisdom of the young, who sometimes see things clearer than the old, was right. The suffering had not been in vain. It had carved in them a capacity to love that perhaps they would not have developed otherwise. It had taught them that love is not just joy, but also a choice, a struggle, and sometimes pain, but a pain that, when crossed with honesty and courage, transforms into something precious. And so the years rolled by, peaceful on the surface, but deep in meaning. The mill kept turning, the farm kept producing, and life went on with the steady rhythm of things well made. Morenike and Ayodele grew old together. And the beautiful thing about growing old together is that you do not notice the changes in the other, because they are happening at the same time in both of you. Ayodele's hair went gray, then white, and Morenike did not really notice when it happened. She just looked one day and realized he was different from the young man she had met, but no less handsome. Morenike's hands grew rougher, more lined, and Ayodele kissed those hands with the same reverence with which he had kissed the soft hands of the 22-year-old girl. They had a ritual in their later years. Every Friday, without fail, they went to the pool in the clearing, the place Ayodele had tended during their 6 years of separation, the place that had been theirs when they were young. They carried coffee in a thermos, steamed corn pudding Morenike had made in the morning, and sat on the bench Ayodele had built, which was now worn by time but still sturdy. They sat there looking at the water, listening to the birds, talking of small things or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of those who do not need to fill every second with words. During these meetings at the pool, when they were so waged, Morenike asked Ayodele if he regretted anything. He thought for a long time, sipping his coffee slowly, and replied that he did regret something. He regretted not going after her when she left 6 years before, that he should have followed the cart, should have stopped her on the road, should have demanded a real conversation instead of letting pride decide for him. But paradoxically, if he had done that, perhaps they would not have learned the lessons they needed to learn. Perhaps they would have married young, full of certainty, and fought over the wrong things. So in the end, he did not know whether to regret it or be grateful. Morenike said she understood perfectly that she too regretted leaving without fighting more. But at the same time, those years in the city, hard as they were, had made her the woman who was able to return and rebuild the mill on her own. They had given her a strength she might not have had if she had always been protected. And in the end, looking back, she saw that life had a strange way of making things work out, even when it seemed everything was going wrong. Ayodele agreed. and said something Morenike never forgot. He said their love was like a mill, which needed running water to work. And if the water stopped, everything stopped. And the water, in their case, was the truth. As long as they continued to be honest with each other, as long as they kept talking, even when it was hard, as long as they kept choosing every day to be together, the water would keep flowing and the mill would keep turning. But the day they began to hide things, to harbor grudges, to let pride build walls, the water would dry up, and without water, no mill can work. That conversation echoed in Morenike's mind for a long time, and she realized that was why their marriage had succeeded. Not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. Not because they never fought, but because they always made peace. Not because it was easy, but because they made it worth it. And that, she understood, was the secret. So many marriages lost along the way, the realization that a relationship is not a destiny, but a choice, that love is not something that simply happens, and that is it, but something you cultivate, something you tend, something you water every single day. And when the time finally came for them to depart, first she, then he, it was with the clear conscience of those who had lived well, loved truly, and had not wasted the time they had. For yes, they had lost 6 years, but they recovered 30-some. And those 30-some years were so full, so true, and so well lived, that they were worth an entire lifetime. The story of their love became a legend in the region, not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was real. It was about real people, with real flaws, who made real mistakes, and yet managed to build something beautiful. And that is why, even today, when anyone in Odo Eye talks of true love, they speak of Morenike and Ayodele, not because it was a perfect love, but because it was a love that endured, that survived, and that conquered. And every time I tell this story, I ask myself how many Morenikes and how many Ayodeles are out there in the world, separated by lies that others have planted, by pride they themselves have fed, or by fear of being honest. How many true loves are being wasted because no one has the courage to take the first step, to reach out their hand, or to speak the truth, even when it hurts. And I want you, who are watching, to know this. If you have someone you love, but whom pride, or resentment, or time has driven away, think carefully before letting more time pass, because 6 years can easily turn into 10, and 10 can turn into 20, and 20 can turn into a lifetime. And in the end, when we are old and looking back, we do not regret the things we did. We regret the things we did not do, the words we did not say, and the hands we did not hold. The most beautiful love story of Odo Eye was indeed hidden behind 6 years of enmity. But when it was found, it shone with an intensity that illuminated not only the lives of the two of them, but the lives of everyone around. Because true love is like that, it does not stay contained, it overflows, it connects, and it inspires. And if this story inspired you in some way, if it made you think of someone, or if it made you feel that there is still hope for true love in this fast and superficial world, then my work here has been done. For that is why I tell these stories, to remind us that the old values of truth, forgiveness, and love, built day by day, still make sense, are still possible, and are still the most precious things we can have. Thank you for staying here to listen to this story with me. I hope it has warmed your heart as much as it warmed mine to tell it. Until the next story, my friend. And remember, it is never too late for the truth, and it is never too late for love.